Welcome to This Explainer. Okay, today we're actually stepping back in time to explore an absolute foundational masterpiece of botanical organization. We are going to bring E.V. Watson's fascinating 1971 Bryophyta classification flowchart to life. If you've ever found yourself wondering exactly how botanists make sense of the sprawling, incredible world of early land plants, well, you are in exactly the right place. Let's get into it. Right, let's dive straight into this macroscopic view of division Bryophyta, which is really going to act as our roadmap today. It is just amazing how beautifully Watson organized this plant classification. He takes the entire division and splits it into three highly distinct taxonomic branches, with each one representing a totally unique evolutionary path. We're going to break this complex matrix down together, step by step, so you can see exactly how a plant's physical form actually dictates its classification. So, here's our game plan. We'll start with Watson's 1971 Bryophyta map to get the big picture. Then we'll zoom into the specific traits of Hepaticae, the liverworts. After that, we'll cover Anthoceratae, the hornwort branch, scale up to Mussy, the moss branch, and finally, we'll synthesize everything by comparing their key traits. All right, part 1. Watson's 1971 Bryophyta map, the big picture. The absolute most crucial thing to grasp right out of the gate is that every single family and order we're about to talk about traces its lineage back to one single parent. Division Bryophyta. Think of it like the main trunk of our taxonomic tree. In Watson's framework, everything flows outward from this fundamental grouping of non-vascular plants. Basically, if a specimen belongs here, it has to fit into one of the three upcoming branches.
Moving right along to part 2, Hepaticae, the liverwort branch. This is our first major branch.
What's really fascinating about liverworts in this 1971 map is their structural flexibility. Their gametophyte, the main plant body you actually see when you're out in the woods, can be either thalloid, meaning flattened and kind of ribbon-like, or it can be leafy. Plus, Watson explicitly notes that their sporophyte often completely lacks aceta. The aceta is just that little stalk that normally holds up the spore capsule, so missing it is a huge defining characteristic. So let's see how that flexibility builds out the internal structure of the liverwort class. Under this Hepaticae umbrella, Watson categorizes 4 distinct orders. You get a real sense of the progression here, starting from the Marchentaliales, which has families like Marcanticiaceae, flowing right down through Sphaerocarpelles and Jungermanales, all the way to the highly specific single-family order of Calobriales. That one actually only houses the Haplometriaceae. It's just a beautifully structured hierarchy. Okay, on to part 3, Anthoceratae, the hornwort branch number 2. Now for the hornworts, Watson lays down 3 very strict rules. First, unlike those flexible liverworts we just talked about, hornworts feature a strictly thalloid gametophyte. No leaves allowed here. Second, they have an indeterminate elongated sporophyte, which, by the way, is exactly where the horn in hornwort comes from. And third, zooming in to a microscopic level, they possess these really unique chloroplasts containing pyrenoids. Those are basically tiny microcompartments that help the plant fix carbon. These distinct physical and cellular rules just isolate them perfectly on their own branch. And because their physical rules are so incredibly rigid, their taxonomic tree ends up being super streamlined. Unlike the heavily branched liverworts, the hornwort class in this 1971 chart relies on just one distinct order, Anthoceratales. And inside that order, literally just a single family, the Anthoceratosaceae. It is taxonomic minimalism at its absolute finest. Which brings us to part 4. Mussy, the moss branch, our third and final branch. Talk about a stark contrast. Watson defines the mosses, by 3 completely different parameters. First up, they have a purely leafy gametophyte. Second, they develop through a really specific early phase called a protonema stage. That's essentially this little thread-like chain of cells that forms the very earliest phase of a moss's life. And third, which is probably the most important for their classification, they possess a highly complex, highly differentiated sporophyte. They are just architecturally way more intricate than the liverworts or the hornworts. To get a bit more precise about that intricacy, Watson specifically points out that these mosses feature a complex columella sporophyte. That means they have a specialized central column of sterile tissue right inside their spore capsule. He even highlights specific examples for us, pointing to Polytrichium and Phaneria as prime illustrations of this advanced biological differentiation. This complex structure is really the crowning anatomical achievement of the musty branch. So, how exactly does all that complexity organize itself? Well, the moss branch splits into three primary orders. We start off with the Sphagnales, which houses the Sphagnaceae, and that's followed by the Untrailius. But it is the third order, Bryoles, that absolutely explodes with biodiversity. It is wild to consider the sheer density of order Bryoles. It houses 7 massive families, stretching from Polytrichaceae down through Physidentaceae, Funeraceae, Bryaceae, Bartramiceaceae, Myiaceaceae, and then finally down to Hypnaceaceae. Having this single massive order easily makes class Muskie the absolute heavyweight of the entire 1971 chart. Finally, Part 5, comparing key bryophyte traits, synthesizing Watson's map. All right, let's put these guys head to head, starting with the gametophyte differences. This is really where you see the sheer genius of Watson's structural classification. While Hepaticae, the liverworts, have the evolutionary flexibility to be either thalloid or leafy, the other two branches are totally uncompromising. Anthoceratae are rigidly locked into being purely thalloid, and Mussy are rigidly locked into being purely leafy. And then, when we compare their sporophytes, the distinctions become even more profound. The liverworts frequently lack a seta altogether, keeping them quite basic. The hornworts stretch out with that indeterminate, elongated structure. But the mosses, they stand entirely alone with their complex, highly differentiated columella structures. When you put it all together, it brilliantly synthesizes the entire foundation of Watson's 1971 taxonomy. It shows you exactly how these specific anatomical traits, like whether you have leaves or whether your sporophyte is simple or complex, completely dictate the classification of every single early plant in the division. It isn't arbitrary at all, it's a direct reflection of physical reality. So zooming all the way back out to our original map, you can really appreciate the beautiful, logical progression here. It's suddenly no longer just a collection of Latin names, right? You can trace the lineage from a single overarching division, division Bryophyta, right down into the highly specific, trait-based orders and families. You can see the minimalism of the hornworts perfectly balanced against the sprawling biodiversity of the mosses. Which honestly leaves us with a pretty fascinating thought to chew on. Watson built this absolute masterpiece back in 1971 based entirely on observable physical traits. But as our scientific tools advance, especially in the realm of modern genetics and DNA sequencing, is the structural logic of Watson's map going to hold firm? Or are we destined to redraw the entire plant tree of life from scratch? It is a thrilling question for the future of taxonomy. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking questions, and I'll catch you next time.